This is the European edition of Breaking Banks, the world's #1 fintech podcast and radio show. We bring you the European unicorns, startups, founders, regulators, and leaders innovating the rapidly evolving fintech scene today. A truly localized podcast with both English and local language content, with some of the world's most well-known hosts and influencers in the fintech sector globally. Join us every week as we explore what makes the European Union a phenomenal proving ground for many of the fastest growing fintech plays in the world today. Okay, let's roll.
Hey guys, welcome back to a very special episode of Breaking Banks Europe. I'm here at Money2020 with a very good friend. Ben from Nala, welcome to Breaking Banks Europe.
Thank you so much, Matteo. It's great to be here. It's exciting. Maybe I should say ciao, because I just came from Italy.
So, Ben, you and I go back a little while, probably 6-7 years. We met for the first time in Tanzania, your home country, but you have a super interesting mix of nationalities. So give us a little bit of background on yourself, and then we kick it off.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, everybody always tells me, like, look, I was like, how are you going to call yourself African? You look Indian and you got a Mexican last name. What's going on? My name is Benjamin Fernandes. I'm from Tanzania. So ethnically, I'm Indian, East African. So in the 1800s, a lot of Indians moved from south of India to East Africa when the British rule had both India and East Africa. And that's how my great-grandparents came to town. And then I've been there for 4 generations, so I just call myself Tanzanian at this point. I don't speak any Indian languages. Actually, my first time in India was like a few years ago, and I've never been to Goa, which is where I'm ethnically originally from.
Great. So, Ben, tell us a little bit about your story. How do you become an entrepreneur? And, we're getting personal here,
wow.
Because, by the way, I just came out from another podcast and they interview you as well. So we certainly have a couple of common passions, talent being one. We're going to talk a lot about it, and talent in Africa especially. But before, tell us how you became an entrepreneur, from your study time into your haha moment when you say, okay, I want to build my own stuff.
Wow. So there's a really personal story, but okay. So I grew up in Tanzania, and when I never thought I'd be a founder or start a company or anything like that. Neither my mom or my dad have been to university or to grad school or anything like that. So when I was 17, I got a scholarship that took me to America for the first time to study. And during that time I was studying, I became a TV host. So I used to be a TV host every single summer. I was hosting Monday Night Live. I hosted the Olympics in 2012 for Tanzania. And that was how I was getting into television and being a media personality and presenting. And I did that every single year during undergrad. And then when I was finishing undergrad, 2 things happened. One, M-Pesa and mobile money was blowing up in East Africa and in Tanzania. And one of my bosses asked me, can we build an ability for people to pay for TV subscription on mobile money so we can collect fees? And that was the first project I had worked on. And so I didn't expect that to be my passion for payments, that I didn't expect that to spark an interest and curiosity in payments, but that's where it started. And then the second thing that happened was one of my professors came and pulled me on the side. He's like, hey, listen, I know you want to go back to Africa, but promise me one thing. I was like, what? And he's like, promise me you're going to go to Stanford and Harvard and nowhere else. I was like, for what? He's like, for grad school. I was like, dude, I don't know anybody in my life who's been to both those schools. Like, it's out of my league. It's not even something I think about. He said, no, you should apply. You'll get in. So I was like, okay, cool. So, he sparked this interest of maybe there's a possibility. Maybe I might be able to get in. So I went back to Tanzania and I was working and I did this thing in mobile money and payments. And that's what I wrote about. And then I applied to Stanford and Harvard. And then they gave me a full scholarship. So Stanford gave out a full scholarship to 8 African students a year. And that's how I managed to get there. And I talked about the project. So I actually got into Stanford when I was 20 years old. And I didn't, I was like this child in school. The average age in the program was 29. And I, first time in the Bay Area, never had lived in California before. Second time going to the US for school and moved to the Bay Area. And so when you're in the Bay Area, you're around so many entrepreneurs in tech, it sparks even more curiosity. So in the summer, I ended up working at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. In the payments team, I was looking at payments across Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. And then I started to see many more issues within the payments infrastructure space in Africa. And I started to complain about it in school, and I tell my friends, like, guy, like at a random dinner, I was like, hey, did you know that this is broken in Africa and it's not the same case in Europe or the US or Latin America? And my friends were like, so? I'm like, what do you mean, so?
Were they able to even put all these countries, just name in the map? Of course
No,
not, right?
no, definitely not. But they'd always tell me so. And I was like, what do you mean so? And they're like, so what are you going to do about it? And I was like, yeah, somebody should fix this. And I was like, why isn't that somebody you? And when you're surrounded by so many people that keep asking you that question so frequently, you start to really ask yourself. And I was like, hey, look, I'm too young. I don't have enough experience. I don't have enough money. Like, I'm not an expert in building payments companies. And when you're challenged by people around you so frequently, you start to really ask yourself, okay, maybe what if I try? And I was like, cool, let me just try. So that was the moment I decided to, when I was leaving business school, I had a bunch of offers from different payment companies, actually a lot of them that are here today in Money2020. And I decided to take the one flight back home and flew to Tanzania and just started to do a lot of user interviews to try to understand problems better. And actually, we met maybe 1 or 2 months after I moved back to Tanzania in one of the programs you were running in Tanzania.
Amazing. I remember that time really, really well. And by the way, there is something that you don't know, but when we were sitting in Zanzibar back then, we were like around the table with Lazaro, a bunch of friends remember, and Costa was there as well from the Gates Foundation. And this is where Time Pledge was born. So because I said, what the hell are we doing around this table sipping cocktails when there are a bunch of entrepreneurs outside that might need our expertise, and we're here and we're staying 2 more days, our conference is over. So I launched Time Pledge, and since then, actually, like 2,000 entrepreneurs passed by our programs because I said, listen, every time we go somewhere, there is no reason why we shouldn't open up and go talk to entrepreneurs about soft skills and stuff.
Yeah.
And this segue, and by the way, I discovered there is another thing we have in common because I was also the first university of guy, in my family from a very small village. So I didn't know that. That's amazing. I have two questions. First is because a lot of first-time entrepreneurs will relate with your story, man. So someone who a priori wouldn't have the means and the money and the connections. So you said that the first thing you did is go search to validate the problem, right? But what was the second thing you did? How do you surround yourself? Did you get someone because someone had to develop the tech part as well? What it is that you did first?
Yeah, so I think the first thing, and my advice to anybody starting a company is you got to fall in love with the problem. Once you understand the problem better than anybody else, you're going to gain unique insight about the problem and unique things that you can do about it. So, for example, the first 2 months, I interviewed 700 people in 2.5 months.
Wow.
And I'll try to identify patterns. Okay, what's common within the age category of 35 to 42? What's common between the age category of 17 to 21? Between how they spend financial services and what they're using. And you see different patterns for university students. It's very different for young working professionals. It's very different from people who are in their 40s who might want to do a couple first investments. It's very different in different markets between Tanzania and Uganda. And so when you start to pattern identify, the other thing I was reaching out to experts in the field. So for example, the first time I met the founder of Monzo, so Jonas, the CTO and co-founder, I cold emailed him out of nowhere. Actually, I cold emailed him probably the week after I met you. I can show you the email, but I literally wrote something like, hey Jonas, I know this is a long shot, but you can't win races you haven't started. My name is Benjamin. I'm the founder of this company in Africa. I'm really inspired by what you're doing. I've watched every single Monzo video of yours. And I'm curious if I can get 15 minutes of your time to chat. Jonas responded to me the next day. And then 2 weeks later, I'm talking to Jonas, who's the co-founder and CTO of one of the 8th largest bank in the UK. And, it was people like that where as soon as I finished the phone call, I was telling him, hey, I would love your advice on how to think about building this company. And here are the patterns I'm identifying. How do you focus on which problem to solve? And he would really challenge me and ask me questions like, okay, well, what do you think? He's like, I'm not the expert on Africa. But you have to understand, okay, how big is the market for that issue you're trying to solve? Which specific problem you're trying to solve, and how big can that market get, and what do you see that market in 5 years? And so when I was speaking to people like Jonas, I'd ask them, what do you wish you knew when you started? Where do you see the industry going today? If you were starting all over again today, what would you do differently? And so from that 30-minute conversation, I get 5 years of free insight from somebody who's an expert of one of the biggest digital banks in the world, actually. And for me, that sort of mentorship and advice was really useful. And so I started doing that more frequently. So I started hitting up who is the person in Latin America I admire. So I emailed David Velez from Nubank, and David responded to me. And 3 weeks later, I was on the phone call with David Velez from Nubank. And today, a lot of them are investors in Nala. So like Vlad, the founder of Robinhood, is an investor in Nala. Victor, the founder of Klarna, is an investor in Nala. Jonas, the founder of Monzo, is an investor in Nala. Alex, the founder of Deal, is an investor in Nala. And these are all people that, you meet, you try to chat with, you try to build a relationship with. And it took 2 years for Jonas to even invest his first check in Nala. I consistently sent him updates every single month for 2 years. And then he finally just like, okay, cool. And you know what? Like, this guy's very disciplined. Like, I've seen his pattern and growth over the last 2 years. Let me just put a check in. Now, when somebody like that invests in your company, it builds trust by association. So now all of a sudden, the investors who have backed those people are like, why did Jonas invest in Nala? Right? It creates curiosity. It creates establishment of trust. And like a lot of larger VCs are like, okay, actually, maybe let's pay attention to Nala. Let's look at Nala. And so our first check actually came from the Gates Foundation through the DFS lab.
Yeah.
And then I applied to Y Combinator, I think 6 or 7 times. 6 times. I got in once. So most people don't know that. People are like, oh, they just got into YC, whatever. I'm like, actually, guys, I applied like 6 times to get into YC. Yeah. And for those who don't know, YC is one of the best accelerator programs in the world. Like they've minted Dropbox, Airbnb, Stripe, many of the companies here as well at Money2020. Some of the top leading fintech companies in the world came from YC. But when you get into that program, it really pushes you about one question they ask you is like, are you making something people need? Are you making something people want? And that's the question they ask you throughout the program. Every week you're asked, okay, Matteo, how many users did you talk to today? How many customers did you talk to this week? And even, a couple of years out of YC, I went back to see Gary Tan, who's the CEO of YC, 4 weeks ago. And as soon as I sat down with him, he was like, so Benji, how many users did you talk to this week? Same pattern, same thing, because they really focus on like understanding the customer. And so that's where we got our first levels of funding, and then things started to build up from there.
What, guys, if you guys are listening to this is quickly turning into a workshop, a live workshop from Ben, because a lot of people ask, okay, how do you get attention, from these big shots? Sometimes, dropping a blind, DM on LinkedIn and something. But it looks like if you're driven by the right motivation, if you do your homework, and if you ask a question that is, open enough to let them understand that, you are someone worth to help. But at the same time, persistency, right? What brought you to all this? Because this is something that a lot of entrepreneurs struggle with. Everyone seems to, be against a wall of, people they could talk and they never reach. Mm-hmm. You seem to have reached like a lot of superstar CEOs just by being persistent and doing your homework, right?
Yeah, it's a lot of like a proactive versus reactive hustle. So like, I have a spreadsheet every single year that I look at. I'm like, okay, who are the people I really admire that I want to meet this year? And every single month, like I did it 3 days ago, June 1st, okay, where am I at with this goal? Have I spoken to these people? What can I learn from them? And it's just trying to absorb and learn from other people, I think is something that, the accountability of doing it. Everybody can have the idea and passion to do it, but the execution of actually actioning every month. For me, June 1st, July 1st is the day that I sit down in the evening for like 2-3 hours, I review. I have a whole spreadsheet of like, okay, these are the things and my goals for the year. For example, one of the ones is write an article every month. Like, did I write an article this month? Okay, if not, why not? And just forcing yourself to be disciplined about that makes you take more action around it.
Take note, guys. Okay, so Ben, we saw each other, I believe, 2 weeks ago. Seems, ages already. But we were in Ghana at the 3i event, and you did a marvelous speech, which I really advise you to listen to at our founders' peak. And one of the sentences I do remember is talent the first commodity Africa is exporting?
Yeah.
So coming from someone who built a company in Tanzania that today operates at least in UK, Europe, and the US.
Yeah.
Okay, so you are like a talent that was able to export, business outside of the continent. Mm-hmm. And I'm super passionate about talent, and I'm super convinced as well that, out of the youngest continent of the planet, and out of the million people, young people that will come in the next 5 years, this is where smart companies should bet at, to find the next wave of talents. But, how do you see the diaspora? How do you keep the African talents being the business in the continent and then export it afterwards like you did?
Yeah, no. So for example, for context for everybody listening, Africa today has 1.3 billion people. By 2050, it's going to be 2.5 billion people. And there's about 1 million people who form and leave the continent every single year. So if it's going to be 2.5 billion, it's the largest continent in the world, largest workforce in the world is going to be on the African continent. Now there's a big problem, right? Because huge population growth size, the local markets aren't producing as much like locally to export to bring dollars into develop local economies. Now, a lot of African governments have to take out loans from the IMF, and so on. And then you take out the loans in US dollars, you pay it back in, you collect revenues in local currency through taxes, and you have to convert it back to US dollars. But if you look at inflation across Africa, everybody's chart looks like this, where the dollar compared to your local currency is getting worse every year. Like local currency is getting worse because there's so many macroeconomic dynamics that are in play. Now, if you look at people across the African continent, not just in Africa, but in most emerging markets globally. So, for example, if you look at India, India has about 1.2 billion people today. India exports $468 billion a year. The largest export is refined petroleum that brings in $79 billion a year of dollars into India. However, if that's the single largest export in India, remittances bring in $125 billion a year to India. So nearly double the largest export, which tells you and begs you to ask the question, are people India's largest value asset to its economy? Same thing with Africa. If you look at Egypt, if you look at Nigeria, Egypt exports about, I think it's $21 billion, and refined petroleum is about $9 billion there. Remittances alone to Egypt is $26 billion. So remittances as a single category brings in more money to Egypt than any single export that the country does. So if you really think about it this way and look at this as a category, there's a lot of talent in Africa, but talent is equally distributed, but opportunity isn't. And that's the question where I like that we've been discussing is, okay, how do you grant people across the African continent unique opportunities even abroad, where their financial contribution for people locally in the market or to the local economies is significant and brings a lot of value add to local organizations, but also they start to invest and build property and buy houses and start businesses back in Africa that contribute significantly to the economies. And so that's the question I always think about is, as the region grows over the next 5 to 10 years, every single company here in Money2020, whether they like it or not, they'll have to have some business in Africa. It's not by choice, but by nature of the market. Netflix, for example, maybe operates in 3 countries today. There's 54. Who's going to take them to 20 countries in 5 years, right? They'll have to figure out payments, their collections, disbursements, and so on. That's where we as NALA try to resolve and build infrastructure for. But, with the region as it looks at talent, like what are we doing to harness more talent? What might we do to, the same way people have, India 15 years ago where there was like outsourced engineering talent there, or Philippines for, customer support and things like that. Okay, what does Africa look like, especially with being the same time zone as Europe? Those are the questions we have to ask.
There is also something about, you mentioned there are 53 countries in Africa, but there are also different tiers, right? So everyone, look at the poster child, the Nigeria, the M-Pesa in Kenya, and, Egypt, you mentioned as well. And then there are what I call the tier 2 English-speaking Africa, but also the 400 million Francophone Africa and the 100 million Lusophone Africa. I live in Lisbon. I spoke with the governor of Sao Tome, a country that probably half of the auditors wouldn't still place today in that, but is a beautiful, mainly touristic Lusophone country. 2 beautiful islands just in front of Ghana, right? So the governor of the Central Bank of Sao Tome says, listen, we have a full digital agenda for now and 2030. We need everything, but most importantly, we need smart way to invest money that is coming from the different donors, the energies, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and we need smart people to actually deploy this money, right? So how many Africas are we talking about? And if the strategy seems to be sort of already semi-written for the most popular countries, how do you include the different other regions, right? Especially both in terms of payments and financial inclusion, but also in terms of like business development and talents, for example.
Yeah, I think that's hard though, because for example, if you look at even the United States, right? There's 50 states and you have Silicon Valley and then you have like New York, and I'm talking about for tech, and then you have like the Boston area. And then all these other states like Utah or like, Minnesota is not going to be known for tech, like, today. and or like, oh, it's a huge tech ecosystem in South Dakota or whatever, you know.
By the way, sorry, cheers to Derek White from Utah, Galileo, huge tech company. You know, I do remember. You're always in my heart. Okay, so Utah wasn't personal.
Yeah.
Sorry, just
yeah, no, for sure. But if we look at my point is, in every region globally, there's always going to be ecosystems and hubs that are built in certain markets, right? So if you look at Africa, as you mentioned, there's Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, and Egypt. As a Tanzanian, I'm like, why isn't it Tanzania? Of course, I'm like, why? It should be Tanzania. It should be my country. Or as I saw Burundi in here, the Burundian should be like, why isn't it Burundi? And you know, it won't happen like that. And I think that's okay, because like, let's say Google's opening up an office in East Africa, they're going to pick Nairobi. They're not going to pick Dar es Salaam. And I have that's fine, because like where you can create clusters of talent in certain areas, the ecosystem will naturally develop. But if you look at how you talked about, if you split Africa into 4 regions, right? Francophone Africa versus Anglophone Africa, there is talent there that can be nurtured and be taken to regions that, you know, one of the things I have this saying where I think my theory on this one is, I think English-speaking African countries' economies thrive significantly better than French-speaking or Portuguese-speaking or any other local language-speaking. Because why? Unfortunately, English is the language of trade, and English builds trust. And so in all these markets where you have so many different languages, the markets that are naturally English-speaking are on paper going to do on average significantly better than just a French-speaking market. So how do you think about languages as it comes to talent, as it comes to technology? Do you say, okay, everybody needs to learn English? What about software development that's taught in English? How is that converting into French or other languages in Africa? How does AI play into that? Like, all these language models aren't catering to local African languages. What does that look like in 15 years? You know, these are all the questions that we need to look at. But I think that the clusters of talent can be developed. And I think regions like, let's say, France and and Francophone Africa can significantly help with that.
I see, Benjamin, Nala, in the families of, you know, the Flutterways and the Paystack, you know, and the big, good success stories of Africa. And, you know, that I really congratulate you, because I saw this, you know, adventure starting, you know, a few years ago. So, you know, and, you know, and I know this is going to progress and end well. My question here is, the need is very basic, you know, is micro lending, is salary advance, is mobile payments, and there is no shortage of technical infrastructure to deliver that, right? The thing is, in smaller ecosystem or in less crowded ecosystems, you don't find startups to put money in, but you find maybe smart entrepreneurs with good ideas and great talent. So is maybe another type of approach that is not, hey, let's find the next unicorns, but maybe let's find the next 10 to 15 million company that can be sold and ripple for 100 million. So I feel very strongly about it, where the Silicon Valley approach of unicorns hunting, which is great, because Nala may be one in a few years from now, right? Inshallah, we'll see. But the thing is there in parallel another approach necessary? That's my question.
Yeah, I think, you know what, I actually think that there needs to be more M&A activity happening in Africa. And not just Africa, but most emerging markets. Because let's say you build a company, get sold $15 million. $15 million is insane life-changing money for that entire ecosystem. Now you have like 5 or 6 or 10 of that happening over and over again. Those people start to develop and build local ecosystems in their markets and start to look at Finland, for example, with, what's the company? Was it Wolt in Finland? Like, you know, or what was all the ex-Nokia people, you know, going on and building other companies. So it takes a few of those smaller exits. And that should happen. I think there needs to be way more M&A activity. I think banks need to buy more companies locally in some of these markets that they haven't been buying. And there needs to be, like, the corporate dev arm needs to pay attention. And like, hey, look, there's this fintech company that's supporting this need. Let's say if hospital bill payments that we don't do well, we should acquire them. And until that starts to happen more, I think you're spot on with it. I think as there's more M&A activity of smaller market, you'll also start to see local people invest more into tech companies. Because right now, getting African LPs, there's a lot of wealthy Africans on the continent, but they don't want to invest into African VC funds because it's not something that they've seen tangible returns directly on every single day. A few people who have invested and took early bets. But if I go to like the wealthiest man in Tanzania, it's like, hey, can you invest in Matteo's VC fund? He's going to look at me like, okay, where's the building? And I see this physical building where I know I've invested in, like, that's what I see. That's the structure. I can see it every single day. And I think until a lot of these frequent exits start to happen, it holds back the ecosystem from significant growth.
Last question, because we are about to wrap up. So I've been working in 17 African countries, which for an European guy is certainly above average.
He's been into more African countries than I have. Well, I'll tell you why, because he has a European passport.
True. That's true. And that's we could make a full episode, around breaking barriers, of course.
I'm literally flying to Tanzania tomorrow on the same flight with Matteo just to get a visa to come back to Europe.
Yeah, I'm so sorry, buddy, brother. If I could.
Go on.
So the one common thing of most African entrepreneurs is that, yes, they might actually go abroad to raise capital or to expand and build a foreign branch of the business like you did in the US and the UK. But then they always think of either giving back or coming back or helping back people in the continent. And that sentiment, I feel it stronger in African entrepreneurs than in any other entrepreneurs that I have met. Yeah. Would you share this sentiment? I mean, would you agree with my analysis?
1,000%. Yeah, because even we see the behavior for our customers move, let's say, from Kenya to London, and then they send maybe 30% of their income home every single month. Amazing. And that's, we're just like, oh, why isn't somebody in Europe sending, if you ask somebody who moved from London to New York, it's like, hey, do you send money to your mom? They're like, no. But with Africa, it's almost a requirement. Yeah. It's like you have to help. Yeah. Not by choice, but just by market dynamics. Like $10 here is a lot of money. Yeah. So I think that's definitely the sentiment I see. And I think what's really exciting for me is seeing the amount of African entrepreneurs in companies. For example, Calendly is founded by Tope, who's Nigerian. BVNK, is founded by a South African here. And I sat next to him at dinner last night, and he was telling me how initially he was trying to build something for South Africa, and they pivoted and evolved and became BVNK, which is one of the larger companies here at Money2020 today. Yeah. And there's a lot of African entrepreneurs that will be those people and faces of large companies building cool things, but ultimately will want to do something back home. And that's the same with Nala. We've got a lot of work to build. Thank you for the kind words about where we need to go. I have high standards and hopes for our company and where we need to be. Maybe one day we'll be a headline sponsor here in Money2020. We'll see. But budgets are a bit tight right now. So, God, please help me get there. But for the way I look at it personally is, my mom always told me this. She said, Benji, if you don't take responsibility, you take orders. And that's the principle of life. So as I think about building Nala, I think about the impact that we were trying to make across the entire region. And it's hard. Building in Africa is very tough. It's one of the hardest things I've ever done. It keeps me up at night. Every time Matteo's seen me, he's seen my hair reduce and my hairline going back and back and back. Maybe I need to get a haircut like his, and I wouldn't have a problem because nobody will know how old he is. He's actually 25. But that's how I look at it. But so thanks, Matteo.
Ben, it was an amazing conversation. I'm pretty sure we're going to have many more in the future. And guys, you will hear about Nala a lot more in the coming months and years, I'm pretty sure. Ben, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Matteo. Cheers.
Cheers. It's a wrap.
Thanks for listening to Breaking Banks Europe, a Provoke Media podcast in cooperation with Fintech Stage. Don't forget to tweet us out, shout out, or post to the team at Breaking Banks EU on Twitter. If there's something or someone you'd like to hear on our cast, let us know. See you next week on Breaking Banks Europe.